Intuition. The air was thick with heat and anticipation. André Cohn sat in his guest room in Jerusalem, bent over his keyboard, engrossed in preparing his next lecture. With his round glasses and greying full beard, he looked like a rabbi, only the kippah was missing. He will come from the earth, with the words of a lamb, but he will speak like a dragon. This is a warning, he whispered. He looked out of the window. It was still too light to see the first stars twinkling. He turned his gaze to the cloudless sky. I always taught it, I believed it. How could I have known how it would feel? Or will it take a long time yet? Words from two books of the Bible, the Revelation of John and the book of Daniel, were dancing in his head, and he felt a fear rising within him. This fear was fueled by the knowledge he believed he had. Or was it just a guess? Part of him wanted to cry. Another part wanted to cheer. Lost in thought, he reached for the remote control. The flat screen came on instantly. Channel Keshet 12 appeared on the screen, with a newsreader sitting in front of an animation of the solar system. It showed a glowing dot moving from the outer regions of the solar system towards Earth. NASA confirms that Comet Johnson-Smith will cross Earth's orbit in about 8 months. According to current calculations, it will pass Earth at a distance of about 650,000 kilometers. Astronomically speaking, a close flyby. The image showed an interview clip with a scientist who spoke calmly into the camera. This is a spectacular but harmless event. We do not expect any gravitational disturbances, as some alarmists claim, or even a collision. Cohn slowly put the remote control aside and left the screen running without looking at it. Something about the astronomer's sober voice made him shiver. It was all a bit too much at once. Thoughts about his tomorrow's lecture, thoughts about what was going on in Israel, and now this thing whose trajectory was crossing the solar system. Cohn turned off the television, buried his face in his hands, and thought again about his lecture. Most people who were interested in Cohn's work were convinced that the Third Temple in Jerusalem would be the place where the final events of the end times would take place. Namely, when the abomination of desolation mentioned in the Bible, more precisely in Mark 13:14, stands in the holy place. This holy place, the Third Jewish Temple, had been standing for years now, but it had not yet been consecrated. The radical Shiloh party, which had had Israel firmly in its grip for more than a decade, had ensured that any resistance to the leveling of the temple precinct was suppressed with ruthless severity. When ministers who were critical of the Shiloh movement resigned, the Rump government, together with President Eitan Ben Royal, was able to initiate the coup that transformed Israel into a de facto theocracy. The judiciary and the media were finally brought into line. The opposition was suppressed or disempowered, and the constitution was amended to the effect that the office of president was henceforth considered a royal dignity. A paragraph was added to the constitution as well which stated that the kingship should be transferred to the Messiah promised in the Holy Scriptures as soon as he appeared. Many devout Jews hoped that it would only be a matter of a few years before the Messiah came. They considered the biblical saying from Hosea 3:4-5 to have already been fulfilled with the construction of the Third Temple and the restoration of the monarchy. For the sons of Israel shall remain many days without a king and without princes, without sacrifice and without memorial stone. After that the sons of Israel shall return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. The fulfillment of these words was even celebrated in advance, before the foundation stone of the Third Temple was laid. The faithful were thrilled when Rabbi Benjamin Nachman was declared the first official high priest of Israel. He was a somewhat elderly Jewish man, his long hair a balanced blend of 50% grey and 50% still jet black, flowing down past his shoulders in gentle waves. His roundish face bore few wrinkles, suggesting a life of inner peace rather than external toil, and was accentuated by a long, full beard that mirrored the dual tones of his hair. Perched on the bridge of his nose were round glasses with thick black plastic frames, giving him an air of scholarly introspection. He was clad in a traditional kaftan that draped elegantly over his frame, topped with a simple kippah that rested firmly on his head, embodying quiet wisdom and timeless devotion. This happened even before the Shiloh party came to power. The fact that Nachman is a descendant of the biblical Aaron and thus worthy of the priesthood was determined. Among other things, by a genetic test detecting the so-called Cohen haplotype, a specific genetic pattern that can be found in male descendants of the Jewish priestly caste, the Kohanim, who are descendants of Aaron, the brother of Moses. The course for the reign of the Messiah seemed to have been set. The popularity that the Shiloh Party enjoyed, even among secular Zionists, was due in part to its tough stance on domestic and foreign policy. Given this political situation, how should André Cohn wisely phrase his lecture on the history of the Jewish temple? Many of his Jewish listeners were so-called Messianic Jews, who saw Jesus Christ as the promised Messiah. Whether there should ever be one more Jewish temple built of stone, Cohn preferred to avoid this question in his lectures. Cohn, who was himself a Messianic Jew from Switzerland, maintained a certain distance from political events in Israel. However, he was well aware that given the actual situation in Israel, he had to express himself cautiously. The sermon. The news had spread like wildfire. The little man with the drooping left eyelid, whose family allegedly had Jewish roots in ancient Chorasmia, a historic region in western Central Asia, and whose actions had been the center of attention for just over a year, had already spoken to the assembled crowd that morning. The first rumors of his work had been heard in Syria, which had been an Islamic emirate for years. He did not shout, he did not preach, it was as if he were just telling a story aloud. Jesus was a Messiah, he had said, calmly, like a teacher speaking to children. John the Baptist prepared the way for Joshua Jesus, as the biblical prophet Malachi had proclaimed. Muhammad and Moses, peace be upon them, were my voices crying in the wilderness. And truly, I am greater than a prophet, and I am coming into my inheritance. The man wore no insignia. No cross, no Star of David, no crescent moon. Only 2 rings on his hand, one jet black, the other green like an emerald. In the silence that followed, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. In the afternoon heat on the Temple Mount, one might have thought one was looking at an Indian guru. But he was more reminiscent of a Taliban fighter. He wore a black turban, his stern face framed like a royal diadem. Beneath the long, plain white cotton curtain lay an unassuming power that was evident in the effortless elegance of his movements. Children of Abraham, listen. A simple greeting, but the atmosphere became tense. Twice the temple was taken from you, and twice you asked, where is the Messiah? The second time, he was among you. It was Jehoshua Jesus, and you did not recognize him. A murmur went through the ranks. Some lowered their gaze. Jesus said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And you thought he had spoken against the place of God. But he foresaw that this place would fall. Behold, the 3rd temple stands. Not by force or by intrigue, by fulfillment. As the biblical prophet Isaiah said, my house shall be a house of prayer for all nations. And Ezekiel saw the water flowing from the threshold of the sanctuary. This is the Spirit of God, of whom I bear witness. He opened his arms, not in pride, but as a call. I am not the first. I am the second. The first Messiah, Jehoshua Jesus, was rejected, as the scriptures said. But the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. John the Baptist was the precursor of the Messiah whom Israel rejected. And the Messiah was greater than John. Moses and Muhammad were my messengers in the wilderness, and truly, I am greater than Moses and Muhammad. I was with Moses, as Muhammad had revealed. I am the Kidder, and I am the Messiah of Israel. I will prepare the way for the Mahdi. All the prophets before me performed miracles, and so my signs will also be revealed to you. For 3 days I will consecrate the temple. Silence. The light returns, as hope and as kingdom. For I will reign, with a rod of iron. And no nation will teach another to use the sword, for all will listen. He let his hands drop. Not a breath of air stirred. When the sanctuary is in its place, the kingdom of David will begin again in Israel. The lecture. In his lecture, which took place in the morning and was attended almost exclusively by Christians and a few Messianic Jews, André Cohn began by discussing the history of the Jewish temple. The Dome of the Rock, with its striking golden dome, which had been built by Muslims in the Temple district in the 7th century AD, had already been history for years. The temple area had been leveled with relentless harshness. In its place now stood the 3rd temple, an imposing structure, built strictly according to the specifications found in the book of the biblical prophet Ezekiel. The first temple had a predecessor, the tabernacle. It was built 2 months after Israel's exodus from Egypt and consecrated about a year later. Only King Solomon was destined to build the first temple out of stone, at a place chosen by God. In 586 BC, this first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians as punishment. Cone was convinced, for Israel's turning to foreign gods. The Jewish people were then deported to Babylon into captivity. Cone began raving as he recounted the Jewish people's longing for their homeland and for the temple during their captivity in Babylon. There was melancholy in his voice when he mentioned in his lecture that Psalm 137 recalls the period of the so-called Babylonian exile. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept. Cone continued his lecture. Babylon, which had taken the Jews into captivity, was later conquered by the Persians in 539 BC. And it was the Persian king Cyrus II who then told the Jewish people that they could leave and build God a second temple. The second temple was in use from 516 BC until 70 AD, when it was destroyed by the Romans. Cone went on to say that there was only one Messiah, who for him as a Messianic Jew was none other than Jesus Christ, and that the Messiah was active when the time of the second temple was running out. Christ was killed, and then in 70 AD the second temple was reduced to rubble and ashes by the occupying Romans. Just as the prophets had predicted, because the Jews rejected Jesus as their Messiah, whom the Bible considers to be the temple's cornerstone, as can be learnt from Psalm 118 verse 22, the stone which the builders refused has become the headstone. To some, this merely refers to the Messiah Jesus Christ being the cornerstone of a new faith. Yet other Christians and Messianic Jews see this cornerstone as a promise that the third temple will be physically reconstructed at some point in the future. Cone did not believe the latter. Nowhere in the Bible did he see any evidence that Jesus Christ would exercise any kind of rule as the returning Messiah in the physically rebuilt third temple. On the contrary, the second chapter of the Gospel of John states that Jesus Christ rebuilt the temple in 3 days. This merely symbolic temple was none else but the congregation of the early church as 3 days passed between the crucifixion and the resurrection, after which the new faith was born. After Cone went on to discuss the rejection of Jesus Christ as the Messiah as the reason for the dispersion of the Jewish people, his voice suddenly became quieter, but his words cut through the silence like a sharp knife. The biblical book of Zechariah 14 verse 3 says, "Then shall the Lord go forth, and fight against those nations, as when he fought in the day of battle." What this means is that there will be a final judgment by God, an end to this world. An apocalypse. When will it be? We know that the 69 so-called weeks of years have passed between the prophetic work of the biblical prophet Daniel and the resurrection of Jesus the Messiah. In referring to the 69 weeks of years, Cone was alluding to the words of the prophet Daniel in the Bible, who received his visions during the Babylonian exile, the period when the Jewish people were carried away by the Babylonians. According to the biblical prophet Daniel, 70 weeks are determined upon thy people and upon thy holy city. These weeks do not refer to ordinary weeks of 7 days, but they are so-called weeks of years, periods of 7 years consisting of 360 days each. The prophet Daniel further prophesied that from the time of a royal decree by the Persians allowing to start reconstructing Jerusalem, a period of 69 weeks of years would pass until an anointed one, for Christians and Messianic Jews. No one other than Jesus Christ would be cut off. According to Cone, this prophecy was fulfilled by the crucifixion of Christ. It was the Persian king Artaxerxes I who issued a decree allowing the restoration of Jerusalem, and exactly 483 years later, in 27 AD, Jesus was crucified. Thus, the prophecy of the 69 weeks was fulfilled. What about the 70th week? Cone continued. As concerns the 70th week, the 7 years until the complete destruction of the world in God's last judgment, you see, there is a transition period X from the end of the 69th week, which ended with the crucifixion of Jesus, to the beginning of the last, the 70th week of years. We are now living in this transitional period X, and no one knows when it will end. We as Christians believe that it is the time after the resurrection of Christ. The last week of years, the last 7 years until the last and final judgment, could begin at any time, and we will know that we are in it when, according to biblical prophecy, a false prophet appears and places an abomination, an idol or something similar, in the Holy of Holies of the temple. This is the place where the Ark of the Covenant once stood. A large part of humanity will be led astray. Now the third temple already stands, without the Ark of the Covenant. The biblical book of Ezekiel, which contains the blueprints for the third temple, does not mention the Ark of the Covenant, and this is the reason why there is an empty space in the rebuilt third temple that now stands in Jerusalem. Will something else, an object appointed by Satan, soon be there? Let us be vigilant when people appear who call themselves prophets, or even anointed ones. At the end of his lecture, Cohn, choosing his words carefully, addressed the fact that the mysterious end-time preacher who had preached on the Temple Mount and who had addressed the people as children of Abraham had presented himself not only as the Kidder but as the Messiah of Israel. The man who has been preaching on Temple Mount these days, and to whom people are truly flocking in droves, claims to be a Messiah. He says that the prophecy will be fulfilled in him, that the glory of God will return to the temple in Jerusalem, and that he is, so to speak, the rejected cornerstone. That the temple was built for him. Allegedly, this man is said to have already performed miracles. I recently heard that oil appeared in an empty jug before the eyes of many. He paused, letting the sentence sink like a stone. As for these miracles, have not dark forces also performed miracles? In Exodus 7, verses 10 to 12, for example, we read how Pharaoh's magicians made serpents appear miraculously. A murmur went through the ranks. One of the listeners hastily took notes. What is happening now could be the preparation for what the Gospel of Matthew speaks of as the abomination of desolation in chapter 24 verse 15. And I say this with all urgency. If a person brings something into the temple that has not been ordained by God, if he sets up an image or whatever else that is supposed to unite the nations, then it is not the Lord who is at work there, but an illusion. He took a step back from the lectern and looked into the faces of those gathered. I know many do not want to hear it. It is easier to give in to euphoria. But let us remember the words of Paul, for Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. His gaze softened, but remained intense. I am not asking for alarmism. I am asking for discernment. Test the spirits, and pray that your hearts will not be blinded by false light. For if anyone claiming to be an anointed one is not Christ the Messiah, and he is not, then he is the immediate forerunner of Judgment Day. And then his presence in the temple is not a blessing, but a sign that the hour of tribulation has come, and even that the last week of years has begun before Judgment Day. Some nodded. Others stared thoughtfully at the floor. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to conclude by taking a look at the Quran, more precisely, at the 18th surah, which describes the story of Moses and a mysterious servant of God. This was very unusual for his audience. As a Messianic Jewish Christian, Cohn did not normally quote the Quran. The Quran does not mention him by name, but Islamic tradition gives him the name Al-Qidr, the Green One, the wise man to whom Allah has imparted special knowledge. And the man who is said to have performed miracles not only presents himself as Messiah, with Jewish ancestors from Khwarezmia, but also claims to be an incarnation of this very Qidr. According to Islamic tradition, Qidr is said to have met Moses and still appears to people today. Among the claims made by the man who preached on the Temple Mount is that, as Qidr, he is the precursor of the Mahdi, a righteous ruler whose coming in the distant future Muslims believe in. Although it is written in the Quran that every soul must taste death, many Islamic scholars are certain that Qidr will live until the Day of Judgment. They refer, among other things, to the Islamic scholar and hadith collector Ibn Asakir, who was active in the 12th century. Ibn Asakir wrote that when the hour of his death approached, the Prophet Adam gathered his sons around him and said, "O my sons, Allah will bring punishment upon the people on earth." He was referring to the flood. So after my death, keep my body in a cave and then bury it in the land of Syria. Then the flood came. After the flood ended, Noah, who had built the ark, remained in Babylon and allegedly instructed his 3 sons, Seth, Ham, and Japheth, to bury Adam in Syria. But they did not want to go. Noah said that the prophet Adam had prayed to God that the person who buried him in Syria would live until the last judgment. In the end, a person was found to bury Adam. This person was Qidr, and Adam's prayer was answered. Qidr is supposed to live until the last judgment. Whether he is the precursor of the Mahdi, a righteous ruler of the end times whose arrival Muslims are waiting for, is not known to me from any Islamic tradition. This further jab at the man who spoke on the Temple Mount marked the end of Cohn's lecture on the Jerusalem Temple, after which the participants had the opportunity to ask questions. One listener wanted to know whether there were also people in biblical tradition who would not die until the Last Judgment. Cohn replied, "Yes, there are even several such examples in the Bible. A man who did not have to suffer death for his righteousness is known in the Bible in the form of Enoch, who, according to Genesis 5 verse 24, did not die but was taken up by God. Enoch walked with God, then he was no longer there, for God had taken him. There is also the prophet Elijah, the prophet who brought down fire from heaven. According to the Bible, he too did not die, as can be read in the second book of Kings, chapter 2, verse 11. And it came to pass, as they still went on, and talked, that, behold, there appeared a chariot of fire, and horses of fire, and parted them both asunder, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven." Another listener asked what was meant by a hadith collector. Cohn replied, "Well, you see, in Islam, the Quran is considered to be the direct word of Allah, revealed to the Prophet Muhammad. The so-called hadiths are traditions about what Muhammad is said to have spoken, done, or approved. They are therefore not divine revelation in the strict sense, but rather testimonies of human observation, nevertheless of enormous theological significance, because Islamic jurisprudence and moral norms are derived from them. A hadith collector is someone who, in the centuries after Muhammad's death, made it their task to collect, examine, and organize these traditions. You have to imagine them as a mixture of historian, theologian, and investigator.